Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Reactathon. As he said, my name is Parashuram Narasimhan, and while I understand that the name is pretty good for ensuring that there are no CSS overflows and conference badges, I think you should just call me Ram. That's much easier. Incidentally, I also discovered that even the short name Ram is not immutable at coffee stores. Like, this is what I got today morning. Anyway, jokes apart, I'm a software engineer who recently joined Facebook, and I work on the React Native core team. Before Facebook, I used to work as a program manager at Microsoft. And even back there, I was working on React Native related products like CodePush, VSCode extension for React Native, and App Center or Mobile Center. I was super excited about React Native and the ability to build mobile applications using JavaScript. I'm a web developer myself, and I think what I really like about this technology is I don't have to go learn anything new. In fact, even before React Native, I was working and using Cordova, or PhoneGap, as you may know it. And I even became a committer in the Apache Cordova project. Cordova was perfect for me because I had just learned jQuery, and all I needed to do was write a website, ensure that it works very well on a mobile browser, and then put Cordova on top of it. I was able to reuse all of my skills, and thanks to Cordova, I had access to all device capabilities like contacts, maps, Bluetooth, etc. This was also the time when React came around, and it was only natural for me to dive into React Native because I wanted to go ahead and write native code, write native applications. I did not have to worry about like the long method names of Java that go beyond my widescreen monitor. I do not have to worry about all the weird syntax of Objective-C and its brackets and all of that. All I had to do was write code in a language that I understand. And come on, admit it. The first time you saw JSX, didn't you guys fall in love with it? Yes. Like, JSX was awesome, right? Anyway, so I started React Native. And I thought that knowing and understanding the web, writing mobile applications should not be that different. Boy, oh boy, I was wrong. In fact, as a front-end engineer, all of us have a good attention to detail. And many of you may have already spotted that there's a difference between how the website was presented and how this mobile app is presented. For example, you already see that the labels are inlined because we do not have as much real estate. You also see that we'll have to do things like autofocus. As you start using the mobile application, you'll also run into a bunch of other subtle but important user experience differences. The first one is as you start typing, the keyboard comes up, and the entire content shifts all the way up. When this happens, you need to ensure that the sign-in button, which is critical, also shows up. Otherwise, the user is lost. You have to worry about things like ensuring that the right type of keyboard shows up. You don't have just numbers, but actually have something that lets you enter an email. You can apparently even customize the Go button down there. And all of these, though they look and seem subtle, are very, very important because this is what a mobile user is pretty much used to. In fact, even while typing, you need to ensure that autocomplete doesn't ruin your day, there's no auto capitalization, and the right input validation happens. All of these sort of add up, but I was glad I picked up React Native because what can happen is React Native does give you hooks into writing all of that code. Now I agree, this is a lot more work than just writing a simple text box, but going this extra mile actually gives me user experience points. And the reason I need to do this is because I want to ensure that I've taken the first step to developing a real native mobile application. Why not just go all the way in, right? That's how it started. And this is when I started realizing that there are differences between how you develop for the web platform and for the mobile platform. Eventually, I ran into this second use case where I had to build this application, build a simple comment section, where you see that text box at the bottom that kind of is stuck to the keyboard. This is very common in like iMessage, Facebook Messenger, and all the messaging apps that you see on iOS. And what I had to build was exactly that, with the caveat that if it is in React Native, it shouldn't be janky. It should work with nested scrolls, all of that together. And as a web developer, obviously, I started with JavaScript. Now looking back, maybe that was not the best thing. I was glad to have Peter, who's an iOS engineer, on my team. And I was casually chatting with him and asked him, why do things like these exist and how hard are they to build? And he told me, hey, you don't have to go build this. Apparently, there's a concept in iOS called input accessory view. And Peter was kind enough to actually expose this as a React Native view for me. In fact, I think the React Native core team is going to be releasing this input accessory view today in the React core repo, and you should also be able to use it. But the point I'm trying to make is this. The fact that I had a native engineer on my team and the fact that I was able to go chat with him about this was super critical. I had learned the web platform. And to me, the platform basically meant dealing with the quirks and bugs in IE6, or these days dealing with Safari. On the other hand, not because I'm a Microsoft guy, but on the other hand, the mobile platform is different. And the platform is iOS. The platform is Android. And there are subtle differences. I think it's important for us to embrace the native platform. If you have native engineers on your team, I would highly recommend going and talking to them. In fact, you'd be surprised how easy is it to go talk to them. Remember, they have to compile their code, so they're probably taking a lot of frequent coffee breaks. Anyway, so I went ahead and did this extra work of adding all of this code and adding input accessory view. And this probably brings me to trying to debunk a typical myth that a lot of people have. A lot of people say that if you're building an app for both the platforms, say an iOS platform or the Android platform, the amount of time it takes to build a React application is probably half of it. Now, the fact that you have live reload and hot module replacement removes a significant chunk of that time. We also don't really care about tests as JavaScript engineers, at least most of us, because guess what? We can actually go ship bugs and then use something like CodePush to ship a patch, right? So you remove that time also. And they say, this is what React Native is. And this is exactly why you should build React Native apps. Now, I know I'm on the core React Native team. But my personal opinion is that we should not be building React Native apps. Instead, we should be building native iOS and Android apps with React Native. Now, the difference here might be subtle, but I think it's an important one. So when I mean building a native app, what I mean is the way you think about your entire app is that it is a completely native app. And then React Native is just a small part of it. Now, if you're starting from scratch and writing a greenfield app, you're still building a native app with all screens being React Native. And I wouldn't be wrong if I was to say that this is the perspective that the React Native team has about the entire React Native ecosystem. Through this talk, I'm going to be giving you certain examples of all the things that the React Native team, that the React Native core team has been working over this half to ensure that we are able to build quality React Native apps. And I want to emphasize the fact as to how does the React Native core team look at these apps written using React Native. Now, all of you know that Facebook developed React Native and Facebook uses React Native internally. You'd be surprised at the number of properties or number of internal and external apps that React Native exists in Facebook. And these are not necessarily just plain ground-up React Native apps. They are also a lot of these are actually apps that were built natively, and then React Native was added to it. For my example, I'm going to consider the main Facebook app. How many of you here knew that the main Facebook app uses React Native? Not a lot. That's surprising. So you would be surprised that this icon there at the bottom, that's completely written in React Native. I mean, not just the icon. When you click the icon, the screen that comes up. So that screen is fully React Native. So the marketplace experience on your main Facebook app is completely written in React Native. What that means is, like any React Native application, we start up the Metro bundler. The bundler starts up. We hit Command-Shift-R. You have this familiar green bar at the top that says it's loading the bundle from your local host. You make changes to your CSS, and you ensure that the changes are immediately shown up. I mean, that too, that's a part of the React Native developer experience. But jokes apart, this is a full-fledged React Native application. Now, because it's a part of the entire Facebook app, we needed to ensure that the look and feel of this app is pretty much like the look and feel of the rest of Facebook. Now, I have this video where you would be able to see when I click on, say, the category button or the location button, it kind of has this little bouncy effect. Now, this is important because the rest of the app has this effect. And if this screen did not have it, it would look odd. To your end user, they don't care if an app is written in Swift or Objective-C or React Native. Our users care about the fact that this is a React Native app, and it should look, or this is a Facebook app, and it should look and behave like the rest of the app anywhere. The advantage that we have, however, is the fact that in our style guide, it's super easy to style React Native. So like any web property, like any development houses that have style guides for mobile applications, we have a design system. And that design system dictates how each of these buttons or labels should look and feel. In our case, this is super interesting because we just have to go style these in CSS, and we know how easy is it to do, right? I mean, CSS isn't that hard. You don't have to go worry about like changing it in code and stuff like that. So we were able to achieve this kind of parity where the app feels and looks like the rest of the app using the style guide. And this is usually discounted and often like looked over, but style guides are super important. As web developers, we know how critical is it to ensure that it looks similar on iOS, on Chrome and Internet Explorer. Same thing for mobile applications. But sometimes it's not sufficient if you just go style CSS. You saw the input accessory view example where I had to go write native apps. Now, input accessory view was something that was provided by the platform itself. But there are often cases where you might run into this situation where you have a control that's used in the rest of the native part of your application, but it's not available to React Native. The first instinct that we have is, let's go try writing it in JavaScript. And that's probably what we did. But I think if there's a control that already exists in native, there's no reason not to port it to React Native. Here's an example of that. What I'm going to be doing is, in this example, I'm going to show you a before and an after video. The before video was when we naively went and implemented it in JavaScript. And the after video shows the dramatic improvement in user experience once the native control that was used everywhere else was exposed to React Native. So the component itself is called bottom sheet. And it's that thing that comes up from the bottom when you go click a button. So it's that thing. Now, as you can see, there are a bunch of issues with that. The first thing is you can't swipe the bottom sheet up as you would typically expect. What happens here in this case is when you try to swipe it, the swipe gesture isn't recognized, and instead it turns to an on-click event. You can't snap it to the top, snap it to the bottom, things like that. Now, once we implemented it with the native component, all of the goodness of native component comes in. Like this, the bottom sheet looks exactly like how it looks in the rest of Facebook. You're able to scroll it up. You're able to snap it to the top. You're able to click on buttons. In fact, here's a little more complex example. So in this case, you saw how janky the JavaScript-based implementation was. It was sort of janky because you had to do a bunch of things, including layout calculations, animations, all of that, in this complex piece of UI. On the other hand, if you were to use, say, the bottom sheet that was provided, we got all of it for free. You get the snapping, you get like nested scrolling. In fact, there's a PR open today in the React Native repository that tries to implement nested scrolling for Android. And if all you do is use native components, you get it all for free. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is this. If you have native code, I think it makes sense for us to just pick up those native components and use them in React Native. They don't have to be platform components, but what you get is consistency and the fact that you don't have to deal with all of these extra logic. You just get it all for free, and guess what? You get more free time because you don't have to write extra code. So React Native is not just about native components being inside React Native. It's also what's around it. So before we get there, let me quickly show you the source code of what changed when we moved from JavaScript to native. So this is how the code was written. And when we moved the bottom sheet from using JavaScript to native code, the code changed to this. Yeah, there was no change, literally. So the bottom sheet was a bottom sheet. It was implemented in JavaScript thanks to React's componentization model. All we had to do was change the underlying implementation, and the code continued to live like this. In fact, we could even take this one step ahead and change the code to look something like this. What you can do here is, rather than just the top level being a native component, you can even wrap the individual menu items and make them native components. The scale at which you go, do you want to just wrap the whole thing, or do you want to wrap individual components? That's completely based on what your business case is. And in our case, we had both these options. And we decided that we wanted a lot more flexibility, and we just wrapped the bottom sheet and let any React Native view sit inside the bottom sheet. Now, talking about what's around the screen, because this is the Facebook app, you might come to React Native from a native view or from any other sort of view, right? So this view basically exists or coexists with all the other native screens. And what we want to ensure is when you navigate between views, you don't notice the difference that you're coming to a React Native screen, or you don't notice the difference that you're leaving a React Native screen to go to a native view. In fact, Here's yet another example. Typically, if you look at transitions or navigation, this is what happens on the before slide. You click on it, it slides in and slides out. But with native components or with native code, a lot of people expect a lot more exotic transitions, like this one. This is, if you didn't catch the transition, on the after side, it's like magic move. It's like that transition effect that I've overused in my slide deck. It's a magic move where the whole image transforms over. If you were to implement this in JavaScript, that's actually pretty simple. Like React Native lets you do that. Now, should you do it is a different question. If I do it in React Native, the way I do it is I'd start off by measuring the dimensions and the position of the first image, placing that image on the second screen, and then animating it to grow. Like this is definitely possible. A lot of people have done this. In fact, there have been like blog posts that show how element transitions work. But guess what? Native code actually has ways to do this in a much more performant way so that you don't mess up your layout or add extra views. The way you would do it is you'd assign this element a native ID, which is just a prop on a React Native element. And then you pass that native view into the native API. So in this case, what you're seeing is I've written some Android code where I'm passing that native ID, the source ID, into my native code. And then in the target, I wait for the element to show up, and then I say start my transition. Now, the interesting thing here to notice is my views were managed, styled, and taken care of completely in React Native. But they were passed over to the native view. So I was not passing in entire screens. I don't have to think of React Native as entire screens. I can even look at parts of the React Native screen, pass it over to my native world, and let the native world do its magic. Here's the entire code, and this is much, much easier to write and maintain rather than having to do the entire thing in JavaScript. My point being, just because you can do it in JavaScript does not mean you need to. You can try it out, that's sure, but there might be better ways. And given that we have come up and learned like JSX and ES6 and classes, looking and peeking into like Java and Objective-C isn't that hard. A lot of you may have also noticed this thing where I said, when you do the transition, you need to wait for React Native. That does exist as a problem. And if you click on Marketplace, it's a little hard to find out what happens. But if you were to explode this into a film strip view, here are the various phases. Once you click on it, the React Native bridge loads up. Then you have a network call during which we show a loading state. And then finally, you have the render method. Now, while this is fine, showing that initial the gray background with bridge loading isn't super ideal. Like you don't want like flash of content to the users. This gets even more visible on older devices and lower end devices. And the issue here is this. React Native renders all of its views asynchronously. On the other hand, native views are rendered synchronously. Now, if you were to take this a step back, the real problem that we are running into is this. What we have is a native view, and we want the ability to add React Native views inside that native view. Not a single screen, but multiple React Native views. And the trick there is to ensure that because they are asynchronously laid out, how would you measure them and tell native that this is the space that I need to allocate? Now, that is a hard problem to solve. But lucky for us, there are experiments in this space. And if you have looked at this component called the RCT surface, that's one step towards it. There's something similar on Android. And to us, React Native and native interleave all the time, and this is super critical. Even further, React just introduced the whole concept of fiber, which lets you do asynchronous layouts on the web. You'd be surprised to learn that you can leverage fiber to actually do synchronous layouts on React Native. So the web wants asynchronous, the native wants synchronous layouts. You can actually do that using fiber. In fact, you can use fiber to weave an exotic fabric of React Native user delight, and that way your React Native experiences will actually be amazing. Now, to that extent, we are also working on an experimental renderer. And for those of you who are curious, you should. The experimental renderer is actually leaked into the open source repo. So if you're curious about what the new experimental renderer is, I'd highly recommend going and taking a look at the React Native repository. Now, that's pretty much what the team has been focusing on in terms of React Native. Like, this is what the React Native core team is working on. It's working on three things: quality, to ensure that React Native apps are no less than native apps. It's been 3 years since React Native has released. It's time to go build real native-looking apps with React Native. If we are looking at interoperability, And you saw how many times I combined native and React Native code. And interop is very, very critical for us. In fact, there are a lot of companies out there who are using React Native and who already have a native app. And this interop effort is going to ensure that such scenarios work very well. The final thing is performance. And this has to do with the new renderer that I was talking about. And performance is critical primarily because you don't want to end up with janky apps. You want apps that feel good, that look good. And in our case, the way we believe it is if we are able to deploy it at the Facebook scale to like 1 million users or to like so many of the users, and if React Native is able to sit there and work, all the work that we are doing will eventually trickle down to our internal apps and ensure that React Native is successful, not just in the big blue app, but also the internal apps. The good thing is all of the work that we are doing is also open. It's also open source. So eventually, all of this code ends up in the open source repository, so everyone is able to take advantage of all of the work that we are doing. Now, no talk of React Native is ever going to be complete if I do not call out the community. React Native is much bigger than Facebook. Like, sure, Facebook started it, but there are many more React Native contributors out there in the community. And when I started this job, I went out to the community and asked people what their biggest pain points with React are. Well, here's what they told me. Navigation, which keeps coming up. How many of you here have problems with React Native navigation? Like a lot of them, right? Navigation. OK, I was kidding. I mean, it was not only navigation. While that may have been the truth like 2 months ago when I started working on React Native, it's no longer the reality. The reason being, there's a lot of really good work that the React Native community has done. They have like the Expo team based out of Palo Alto has actually done work to ensure that navigation is much seamless. So navigation is a problem. The next problem that a lot of people have is in terms of breaking changes or upgrading your React Native to the next version. We are at React Native 55, 0.55, and we'll continue to keep iterating and increasing the numbers. How do you ensure that you keep up with the latest React Native releases? That has been a problem. And the third one is finding the right plugin. Honestly, I don't think this is a problem. The community out there is so big that there are so many alternatives. The problem, however, is how do you find and fix the correct plugin and fix the correct alternative, right? So let's try to deal with each one of them one by one. So as far as navigation is concerned, the best way to classify the scenario is right now there are 2 top-level ways of doing navigation. The first one is JavaScript-based, and the second one is native. Now, if it is JavaScript-based navigation, your entire app needs to be in React Native. The advantages of this system is that it's super fast to get started. It's all written in JavaScript. You don't have to worry about native code. But then the problem is all of your views start getting stacked into the same view hierarchy. And that's where when you want to scale, you might want to consider going to native navigation. Internally at Facebook, we use our own version of native navigation all over the place, primarily because we mix and match screens all the time. But if you're an open source, if you're an independent developer on the React Native and don't want to go write your own solution, one good example that I have of native navigation is the one that the Wix guys built. They have this beautiful navigation where you can actually use native constructs like tabs, drawers, pretty similar to what JS navigation does, except it's all done in native. So that way, when you remove a screen and load the other screen, you don't lose out or drain out in memory. So these are the 2 navigation-based systems. There's still a lot of work to be done in a sense that if you start off with JS, moving to a native navigation is still a lot of work. I'm hoping that eventually these 2 communities come together and we have like a singular API, similar to how we think about animated. So when you look at React Native animations, you can do animations in JavaScript, but then you just flip a flag saying, no, I want to do it in native. And you say, use native driver true. I'm hoping that we have a similar solution for React Native navigation also. The second thing is the upgrade path. And this is the part that I'm super excited about. So the reason why upgrading is painful today is not because React Native moves at that speed, but it's because React Native core repository consists of a whole bunch of things. It consists of the core. It consists of UI. It used to consist of documentation. And if you look over the last 2 years, majority of the issues have not been about the core itself. Majority of the issues and majority of the breaking changes have been about independent components like images, scroll views, or flat lists. So the first thing that we are looking to do is split the components into separate repositories. And this is an effort that the Expo folks have already started. The idea here is if you are able to move everything like scroll views, switches, flat list into a separate repository, you'll have a React Native core. that starts incrementing and continues to keep moving forward. And if you have a breaking change, you decide whether you want to pick up a scroll view or you want to continue staying on the same version. Towards this, we've already changed and moved documentation into a separate repository. And I'm not sure if my teammate Hector is around here in the audience, but he actually did this job of moving docs into a separate repo. And this has been amazing. The number of people submitting pull requests into documentation has greatly increased. In fact, when people try or want to contribute into React Native, they believe that they're either a web developer who doesn't know iOS or Android, or that they're native developers who do not know JavaScript. And that kind of prevents them from sending in PRs or contributing into React Native. What we hope is if by separating docs and by separating components, this barrier to entry is removed, and we'll have a lot more people helping out. I mean, the reality is this. We are like 10 people on the React Native core team, and we cannot support the world. It's the community that's doing most of the work, right? And this, I'm hoping, will ensure that we have an inclusive and helpful community. And finally, we want to ensure that we also support platforms in addition to iOS and Android. In fact, platforms like Windows, PlayStation, et cetera, are critical to the success of a system like React Native. And it makes sense for us to support all of these platforms. Finally, I want to sign off by saying that React Native is its community, and every app that you build, in fact, reflects on the quality of React Native. So go forth, build native apps, don't build React Native apps. Build native apps that look and feel native, and use React Native. Thank you.